There's just so much information out there these days, isn't there? It can feel totally overwhelming trying to figure out what actually matters.
Right. Scrolling, listening,
Yeah,
you get lost in it all.
exactly. But maybe the key isn't more stuff from outside. Maybe it's about looking inward at something, I don't know, foundational.
That's exactly where we're headed in this deep dive. We've been looking at some really unique source material. It's from a lecture given during a pretty intensive training session.
Okay, not just a regular talk then.
No, definitely not.
Hmm.
This was in Jeju, and it brought together pastors, disciples, participants from what the source calls 237 regions. That number, 237, pops up a lot, seems to signify a global reach.
237 regions. Wow. And what was the main theme?
Well, the stated theme was the Holy Spirit and how that connects to making a real difference, having an impact. But the path there, according to the speaker, starts with understanding something specific they call the writing of God.
The writing of God. Interesting.
So our mission today is really to unpack these core ideas from the lecture. We want to get a handle on what they mean by the spiritual state,
Okay.
and explore their view on how spirit, soul, and body all fit together. And crucially, this idea of imprints in the brain. It plays a huge role in their framework.
Imprints in the brain. Sounds intriguing. So we're trying to pull out insights that are relevant for you, the listener, no matter your background.
That's the goal. We know the language is specific, theological in places, so we're exploring these ideas as presented in this text, stepping into the specific way of thinking to see what we can learn.
Got it. Stepping into their world for this deep dive, where do we start?
Well, the lecture itself kicks off with a prayer. And this prayer, it really sets the stage, lays out the context and what they're aiming for.
Okay.
It talks about being part of a 300-year evangelism movement. So placing this gathering in a really long historical perspective.
300 years. That definitely sets a tone, framing it as part of something massive and ongoing.
Right. And it speaks of being disciples who held on to the mission in the stream, like they're part of this continuous flow.
A stream of purpose. I like that. What were they actually praying for?
The requests are really specific and tell you a lot. They pray for their spiritual state of fundamental unbelief to be changed into the life of Jesus Christ.
Fundamental unbelief. That sounds serious. Not just everyday doubt.
No, it's positioned as a core, deep-seated thing, and they directly link it to this spiritual state idea.
Okay.
The prayer also asks for Christ's light to shine into something they call the partisan of Satan inside them.
Partisan. That's not a word you hear every day.
No, it isn't. But the speaker explains it. This inner partisan is described as a place where nothing is fundamental but only focuses on physical things.
So a kind of internal fortress built on just worldly stuff, material concerns.
Exactly. That's the metaphor, prioritizing only the physical, the tangible.
That's powerful. What else did the prayer ask for?
A key discovery, that salvation, being everything, is the start of world evangelization.
Okay, so salvation isn't the finish line. It's the starting block for this bigger mission.
Precisely. That seems to be a core message they're reinforcing.
Hmm.
They also pray for answers through this specific training, answers to help them focus purely on the gospel, even when things get really hard.
Makes sense. Focus despite difficulties.
And they have to be filled with the Holy Spirit to focus only on God, cutting out distractions. And there's this repeated theme of needing to receive and actively edit the word within themselves.
Edit the word. What does that imply? Constantly working with it, internalizing it.
It seems so. Like a process of internal transformation, not just passive reception.
Yeah.
And needing this unwavering focus.
And you mentioned the scale of the gathering.
Yes. The prayer acknowledges that too. Thanks is given for these important leaders, pastors, disciples, coming from all those 237 regions.
Yeah.
And they explicitly connect this gathering to Acts chapter 2 in the Bible, seeing it as a modern-day fulfillment of that early church assembly.
Drawing a direct line back to the origins.
Yeah. And they pray for this momentum to keep going towards world evangelization. Plus, a specific prayer for the elders to be filled with the Holy Spirit, highlighting leadership's role.
So a very focused, spiritually intense opening.
Very much so. But then, right after this, the speaker does something quite human. They shift gears for just a second.
Oh.
They mentioned feeling a bit unwell physically after a dedication service, taking medicine. And then they kind of joke, asking which is stronger, the medicine or the Holy Spirit.
Okay, a moment of lightness.
Yeah. And they even add, pray for me if I start to blabber.
Yeah.
It just adds this relatable touch.
It grounds it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Reminds you this is happening with real people, real lives.
It does. But right after that brief personal moment, they pivot straight back to the main point. the absolute necessity of understanding this spiritual state and how that connects to making a difference. That's the core purpose.
Okay, so the spiritual state is front and center, but how do you actually, see it? How does it manifest? The lecture must give examples, right?
It does. The speaker uses a couple of really vivid personal case studies to illustrate exactly that, how to spot it, or maybe how people miss it.
All right, let's hear them.
The first one involves a Kekyu message, like a text message, that the speaker received just that morning.
Okay, very current.
It's from someone they knew, someone who'd been at their church about 5 years back, but left 3 years ago.
Then why did they leave?
Well, the backstory given is key. This person was apparently dissatisfied with the church's focus on what they call remnant ministry, specifically parent education that centered on gospel and spiritual facts.
What did they want instead?
They wanted the church to educate my child correctly. Now, the source adds a really heavy layer here. It mentions the child was born disabled.
Oh, wow.
And this parent was seemingly focused on trying to prove the child was normal, talented. And there's even this disturbing detail mentioned, that the child was reportedly communicating with demons.
Communicating with demons? That's intense. And connects back to the spiritual focus the church was offering, potentially?
You'd think so. But instead of finding answers there, this person left, found another church that, as she put it, fit her preference.
Okay, so 3 years later, she sends this message.
Right, on National Election Day. And the message has nothing to do with her child or spiritual matters, at least not directly.
Mm-hmm.
She's urging the speaker to vote for number 2, a specific candidate.
Why?
Because she's afraid, in her words, that communists conquer our nation.
So, political message driven by fear. How did the speaker interpret that, given her history?
Sharply, through that lens of the spiritual state, the speaker sees her as someone still grappling with this incredibly difficult situation with her child, which the lecture explicitly links to demonic influence, but lacking any real spiritual answer.
Despite changing churches.
Despite changing churches. And so instead, she's pouring all her anxiety into politics, thinking that's the solution, that a specific political outcome will change her life.
What did the speaker reply?
According to the source, just, Sungi, come to your senses, please. Very direct.
Wow. So the takeaway from this example is
that this person, in the speaker's view, doesn't grasp her true problem. Leaving the church didn't fix the core issue because her spiritual state has never changed.
it remained focused on the physical.
Exactly. Her focus is described as entirely physical politics, her child's condition perceived in worldly terms. The speaker mentions her oppressed scars, like old wounds, have gotten tangled up or stuck with the politics. So now politics is what she talks about constantly.
So prioritizing worldly fears and solutions over spiritual ones is a sign of this unchanged state.
That's precisely the illustration. It's presented as a clear symptom. And they add another layer. Her sister is apparently a well-known elder in that community, but the speaker claims she also doesn't have the gospel.
Implying that position or activity doesn't equal this fundamental understanding.
Right. It reinforces that idea. Okay, second case study.
Let's hear it.
This involves someone from America visiting Korea who wanted to buy a meal for the American team that was also visiting. A nice gesture, seemingly.
Seems generous. What happened?
The speaker just said no, flat out.
No. Why turn down a meal?
This is where the diagnosing the spiritual state idea comes in again. The speaker explains they didn't need a long conversation. They assessed the situation based on her spiritual state.
And what did they perceive in her state?
They saw, in their words, that Satan is dragging her here and there, that she had no interest in the gospel, no interest in the church, and fundamentally all she cares about is me and my family and money.
Okay, so a perception of deep self-interest and a lack of spiritual focus.
Yes. Based on that assessment, the speaker decided having a meal together wouldn't be beneficial to anyone. The conversation would likely just circle back to her worldly concerns stemming from that perceived state.
And this ability to see the state, it wasn't obvious to others.
Apparently not. The speaker notes that the people from America weren't able to see her spiritual state. It emphasizes this idea that it requires a specific kind of insight, beyond just surface interaction.
So it's not about appearances.
Not at all. And then, to really hammer the point home, the lecture shares some incredibly tragic backstory about this person's family. Oh boy, her brother's wife had recently committed suicide, hanged herself in a cabinet after a fight with a husband. Just horrific.
That's terrible. How does that connect?
It's about her reaction to this tragedy, viewed through the lens of her spiritual state. After the suicide, more conflict erupted. The mother-in-law apparently attacked the grieving husband physically.
This just gets worse.
And in the middle of all this raw pain, this person, the sister-in-law, whose meal offer was refused, what does she do? According to the speaker, instead of offering comfort or the gospel, she tells her brother to sue the mother-in-law.
Sue her for money.
That's the claim, to profit from the trauma. Her advice was reportedly, there's no reason why you have to be beaten up by that. The speaker contrasts this starkly with what they believe she should have done. Share the gospel with her non-believing, devastated brother.
So her actions in that crisis are presented as proof of her spiritual state being stuck.
Exactly. Stuck in that spiritual state. Her focus, even then, was allegedly on solving her problems, meaning her own gain, her own angle, not the gospel, not the spiritual needs right in front of her. Even the meal offer is interpreted this way, motivated by her situation, not genuine spiritual fellowship.
Okay, these are intense examples. So the big takeaway is that this spiritual state isn't hidden. It actually shows itself.
That's the core point the lecturer is making with these stories. It's visibly peeping out, as they put it, evident in your way of life, your way of thinking.
And being able to see that, to diagnose it, is crucial.
Absolutely crucial, according to this teaching.
Yeah.
Without that ability, you risk being misled. Like by a con artist, the speaker says, if you only judge by appearances how people dress, what they talk about superficially, instead of discerning that underlying spiritual reality.
And you don't need to know someone for ages to see it.
Apparently not. It's presented as an ability to see through the surface, to perceive the spiritual reality that the lecture claims is always broadcasting itself if you have the eyes to see it.
Okay, that sets up the importance of understanding what this spiritual state actually is, which means we need to get into the components, right? Spirit, soul, body.
Exactly. The lecture lays out that familiar tripartite view. Humans are spirit, soul, and body, or flesh.
The body part seems straightforward, our physical selves.
Right. Our body and our life. Simple enough. But the soul, it gets more complex, and the lecture suggests it's often misunderstood.
How do they define the soul?
As having two main aspects. First, emotion. Feeling happy, sad, lonely. Our whole affective side.
Okay.
And the second,
Rationality, our thinking capacity. And this includes consciousness, subconsciousness, and even unconsciousness.
consciousness, subconsciousness, unconsciousness, all part of the soul's rationality.
According to this framework, yes. And the speaker actually mentions a pastor getting confused, mistaking subconsciousness or unconsciousness for the spirit itself.
Highlighting that confusion can exist even among religious people about these terms as defined here. Precisely. It's not just a given that everyone understands these distinctions in the way the lecture presents them.
Do they compare the human soul to anything else?
Briefly, yes. To the animal soul. Animals have soul and flesh, too, for instinct survival. They show emotions. Dogs wag their tails, look sad.
Sure.
But the lecture argues the animal soul doesn't allow for complex, abstract planning, coming together as one and do something and plan for it like humans. It's more about survival of the fittest.
Okay, so the human soul has this higher rational capacity, which leads us to the spirit. How is that defined?
This is critical. The spirit is presented as fundamentally distinct from the soul. It's what was created in the image of God.
And since God doesn't have a physical image,
Being made in God's image means being created as a spiritual being, inherently spiritual, with the capacity to relate to a spiritual God. That's the core definition here.
and getting this definition right is important.
Vitally important, the lecture stresses. They contrast it with how the world might use the word spirit. They mention author Han Kang, a Nobel winner, talking about spirit, but, the speaker claims, defining it more like soul or yearning in their terms.
So a difference in definition.
A crucial one. They also point to the WHO defining humans as body, soul, spirit, but insist the spirit that you talk about is different from the spirit that we talk about. They're carving out a very specific theological meaning.
And if you don't grasp the specific meaning, if your idea of spirit is vague,
The consequence, according to the source, is serious. You won't be able to discern from different works of Satan, demons, and even spirits. You might confuse their activity with something else entirely.
like mistaking demonic influence for just bad thoughts, or confusing it with New Age ideas.
Potentially, yes, or shamanism. The point is, without this clear, specific understanding of spirit, you lack discernment. You have no idea about how Satan is working, demons, or even spirits are working, according to this particular framework. You're essentially blind to that spiritual dimension of reality as they see it.
Okay, so we have spirit, soul, body, distinct but related. How do they interact? Is there a connection point?
Yes, deep interconnectedness. And the lecture pinpoints the brain as the central connection point, the control tower, they call it.
The brain, the physical brain.
Yes. The soul, emotions, rationality influences the brain. And the brain, in turn, influences the spirit, the soul, and the body. It's a feedback loop with the physical brain right in the middle.
That's interesting, the physical brain mediating between the soul and the spirit.
That seems to be the idea. And the brain, though physical, is described as the vessel where our spirit can be put in. It's the necessary container for the spirit in this life.
The spirit needs the body, the brain, to be alive in this sense.
Exactly. Spirit needs a body for life. Spirit separated from the body, that's death.
This helps explain different states then, like brain death versus a coma.
Right. The lecture makes those distinctions. Brain death, control tower is off, person's not alive, funeral follows, vegetable state, brain is still alive, functioning, even if the body isn't responsive.
Yeah.
Coma might look similar, but brain function is different.
Okay, that distinction is clear.
And they use a really striking story to illustrate this brain-spirit connection. A pastor who was in a vegetable state for years.
Yeah.
His wife apparently played messages from Reverend Ryu, presumably the leader of their movement, into his ears constantly. And after years, he woke up.
Wow. And the interpretation of that is?
That the gospel, the word, could still reach his spirit through his living brain, even with no physical response. That hearing the word was making the spirit alive by engaging the brain. It's presented as powerful evidence for this connection.
The brain as the conduit for spiritual input, even in that state. That's quite a claim.
It is. And this leads to a really sharp contrast the lecture draws, a kind of wake-up call moment.
What's the contrast?
They juxtapose the importance they place on the brain and these imprints with what's happening in the secular world versus what they see as a lack of awareness among believers.
How so?
They bring up Elon Musk, investing huge amounts in brain chip technology, initially for medicine, sure, but also talking about future possibilities. Even controlling newborns via imprints, like robots.
Okay, that's provocative. Using Musk as an example of
how Satan's summit, their term for high-level demonic strategy, is intensely focused on the brain, on the power of imprinting things onto the brain. They see this tech focus as proof of a spiritual battleground.
And the contrast is?
With believers who, the lecture claims, have no idea about our imprint. No grasp of the spiritual significance of what gets ingrained in our brains.
So the world, even potentially negative forces, gets the importance of the brain and imprinting, while believers are lagging behind in understanding its spiritual implications.
That's the stark picture they paint. And this perceived lack of awareness brings us right back to the core problem. The spiritual state itself, how these imprints shape it, and the influence of our belief systems.
Okay, let's go deeper into that spiritual state again. You said there are two options.
Right. Darkness, chaos, void. That's the default state we're born into, where Satan operates, according to this view. Or the state of being in the life of Jesus Christ.
And salvation. Does that automatically change the state?
This is a crucial distinction they make. Salvation, through faith in Christ, deals with the fundamental spiritual problem, original sin. It solves the problem, but it doesn't automatically flip the state from darkness, chaos, void to the life of Christ. That internal environment, they argue, remains the default unless it's actively, deliberately changed.
So you can be saved, have the problem solved, but still be operating from that old state.
That's exactly the claim. And they assert that many saved people, including leaders, pastors, missionaries, they haven't actually experienced this change of state.
That's a big statement. How does this connect to unbelief?
They link this unchanged state directly to what they call fundamental unbelief. Not just doubting circumstances, but the same core unbelief as Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, a basic turning away from reliance on God.
And this stems from?
From not clearly understanding sin and Satan, they argue. If your understanding of sin is vague, your understanding of Satan will also be vague.
It all connects.
Yes. They insist Genesis 3 isn't just ancient history, it's happening even now. Satan is active, even within their own faith community, the Darek Bang, working to prevent people from grasping these crucial spiritual facts.
What about personal struggles, like emotional wounds or trauma? Where do they fit in? The scars you mentioned earlier.
They address scars, yes.
Oh.
They acknowledge they're real, but frame them as secondary issues, not the root problem.
Secondary. How so?
The perspective here is that Satan uses these scars. They become a passage, an entry point for demons to influence the heart and mind, which are parts of the soul, remember.
Okay.
The influence can be subtle. Demonic thoughts or feelings can get mixed in, feeling like your own thinking.
So someone whose spiritual state hasn't changed, their heart and mind are vulnerable through these scars.
That's the picture. They're lost in their scars, easily influenced, directed by those wounds and the spiritual forces exploiting them.
What about something like depression? How is that viewed?
From this perspective, it's not just mental health. It's seen as ultimately stemming from that fundamental unbelief, an inability deep down to find God believable, central. And that unbelief manifests or is revealed in the state of depression.
That's a very specific spiritual diagnosis for depression.
It is. And it leads to another important distinction, following an emotional gospel versus being guided by the covenant.
Emotional gospel, meaning guided by feeling.
Pretty much. If the gospel message doesn't fit into your heart, if it doesn't feel right to you emotionally, that feeling itself becomes a form of unbelief. Prioritizing your emotional response over the objective word, the covenant, is presented as a major stumbling block.
This seems connected to the idea of belief systems you mentioned earlier, being stronger than faith.
Exactly. Back to the soul's rationality, specifically consciousness. That's where belief resides, defined here as a strong belief that what you think is right. And the lecture makes that bold claim. For many, these personal belief systems are stronger, more dominant than their actual faith in God.
Where do these strong belief systems come from?
The source identifies two main roots, religiosity and philosophy, and claims these were planted by Satan.
Religiosity, like organized religion.
Not necessarily, more like an innate human tendency towards religious acts. Even outside formal structures, they use a simple example, seeing a pile of stones left by others and feeling compelled to add one yourself, a basic ritualistic impulse.
Okay, an innate tendency. How does that lead to problematic belief systems?
Because this religiosity, they argue, leads humans to create their own definitions of right and wrong, good and evil, not based on God, but on human standards. It's a dichotomy that Satan made.
Satan's dichotomy, good versus evil defined by humans, not God.
Yes. And the lecture insists that any discussion of good and evil that doesn't start with understanding sin, our separation from God, just boils down to nonsense. Worldly morals, ethics, laws, personal standards. They're all seen as operating within this flawed, human-centric, Satan-influenced framework.
What are the consequences of living by these strong, potentially flawed belief systems?
They lead to rigid legalism, harsh standards, and inability to see things clearly from God's perspective. The lecture gives some extreme examples.
Like what?
Like people committing suicide based on their own exacting standards, or someone setting themselves on fire for their nation based on political ideology. The speaker questions if these acts, driven purely by belief systems, represent the gospel.
Implying that being completely trapped in your belief system blinds you to the gospel view.
That's the idea. It prevents seeing things through that different lens.
And this critique extends even to religious leaders.
Very pointedly, yes. The argument is that many leaders, pastors, missionaries included, haven't allowed the gospel to fundamentally transform their own underlying belief system or heal their scars.
Instead, they
hold Christ on the top of their belief system, or on their, he's like an add-on, a layer on top, rather than the foundation that reshapes everything else.
And that's why they can't facilitate real change in others, because they haven't changed fundamentally themselves.
That's the core argument. Even if they bring people to church, if the leader's own heart, their standard, is still rooted in that old belief system, that Satan-derived dichotomy, then nothing truly shifts.
They also mention anti-community members in this context.
Yes, viewed through the same lens. People whose personal belief systems clash strongly with the community's gospel focus. They ultimately chose their own standard of right and wrong over the faith, which the source suggests they didn't truly have anyway. It comes down to that self-centered standard. If you say it's not right, your judgment, based on your system, becomes supreme.
So this keeps people in religion, maybe, but blocks understanding sin.
Exactly. Stuck in that human-defined good-evil framework.
So how does the lecture then define good and evil from the correct perspective, the one rooted in understanding original sin?
It's simple and God-centered. True good is knowing God, wanting to know God, being with God. True evil is opposing God, regardless of worldly success, intelligence, or seeming goodness.
It's all about the relationship with God.
Entirely. And without your eyes open to this definition, rooted in sin and relationship with God, you simply can't see people or situations correctly, according to this teaching.
Which brings us back to the imprints. How do they fit into this picture of belief systems and spiritual state?
They're presented as the bedrock. The lecture states, what's been imprinted in you is me, meaning your core identity, how you function, is shaped by these deep imprints.
So the spiritual battle is really internal against these imprints.
Yes, a war against our influence, the
Right.
influence of Satan's imprints inside us. These things are built up over tens of years, ingrained deeply. They don't just vanish.
And they're described as Satan's bodies underneath us. That's a strong image.
It is like the physical manifestation within our brains and beings of his long-term work. And the conclusion, people live according to these imprints, not the gospel, not faith, because without the gospel being actively imprinted, there's no basis of our brain influencing our spirit in the right way. You're running on the old default programming.
Okay, that's a pretty comprehensive diagnosis. The state, the unbelief, the scars, the belief systems, all tied to these underlying imprints. So what's the solution? How do you fix this?
The lecture offers a very clear path forward.
Yeah.
It involves actively changing those imprints with the gospel. And they give this process a name, editing the gospel.
Editing the gospel, like rewriting the internal script.
That's a good way to put it. This active process of replacing the old imprints with the truths of the gospel is presented as the absolute starting point, the start of seeing God's work in your life.
It's not enough just to hear it or agree with it intellectually.
Apparently not. It has to be deeply integrated, imprinted onto your core.
That cancer patient example you mentioned earlier, how does that illustrate the goal of this editing?
Right. She initially wanted physical healing as her witness. When that didn't happen, she realized salvation itself was the greater gift. A huge realization.
Bet.
But even then, the speaker observed, her spirit is so empty. The insight alone wasn't enough. She still needed to do the work, edit the gospel in your spirit, imprint those truths.
So the focus shifts from the external problem, cancer witness, to the internal work.
Exactly. The disease, the witness, that becomes not important compared to concentrating on the core reality. God sent Jesus Christ. That needs to be imprinted.
And her tendency to get shaken by small things was linked to the lack of these imprints.
Yes. The lecture suggests that if the gospel were truly imprinted, that core stability would be there. You'd never be shaken at that fundamental level, even amidst life's storms.
Okay, so how? How do you actually do this editing, this imprinting? What are the practical steps?
The lecture gets very concrete here. 3 main methods are recommended: transcribing the word, memorizing the word, and meditating on the word.
Transcribing, memorizing, meditating. Sounds disciplined.
It is. The speaker uses that math analogy. You need your multiplication tables down cold to do calculus, right?
Right. Can't skip the basics.
Same idea here. A surface understanding isn't enough for deep spiritual life. These methods are like drilling the multiplication table of the gospel into your brain and spirit.
Does the speaker share any personal experience with this?
Yes, quite powerfully. As a new believer wanting to go into ministry, they apparently transcribed messages for 3 solid years just to get the content ingrained. They directly attribute their own deep imprinting of the gospel to that intense, focused effort.
3 years of transcribing. That's commitment.
It is, and it leads them to critique what they see as laziness when it comes to spirituality in
Yeah.
many church members. People might do 10 minutes of transcription, but without real concentration, missing the whole point of deep engagement for imprinting.
Is there a specific way to transcribe that they recommend?
Yes, a technique focused on maximizing the imprint. Use all 5 senses.
5 senses. How?
Listen to the word, look at the word, and physically write it out by hand. They specifically emphasize handwriting over typing.
Why handwriting?
To really feel the word in your 5 senses, the physical act is seen as helping to embed it more deeply in the brain.
Interesting. Connecting the physical act of writing to the spiritual imprinting process. Does this connect back to the brain science point?
Directly. They mentioned talking to a neuroscience student who understood needing to empty the brain to effectively input new information.
Like clearing space on a hard drive?
Kind of. The point is, even non-believers use techniques for efficient learning and memory. Yet the lecture laments, believers often neglect applying these same principles to imprinting vital spiritual facts onto their spirit and our brain.
And this is why people remain unaware of their true state, because they're not doing this work.
That's the argument. They don't understand the process or the need for actively using the brain to imprint the spirit.
So there's a necessary order to things then.
Yes, a clear progression is outlined. To fulfill the mission, world evangelization, you need to know the flow, God's plan. To know the flow, you need to know the gospel. And to truly understand the gospel transformatively, you need faith in spiritual facts.
And these spiritual facts, they're not just abstract ideas.
No, The lecture insists they are the reality of our life. The fundamental truths about God, sin, Satan, Christ. These form the actual operating system of reality, whether we recognize it or not.
So it all comes back to that internal battle.
Yes, the battle against the imprints that Satan has made in us. And changing those imprints, actively editing the gospel into yourself, is the starting point. That's when you begin to see God's work.
Okay. So if someone engages in this process, editing, imprinting the gospel diligently, what's the outcome? What changes?
The promised result is that the spirit becomes open.
Open. What does that mean practically?
It's described as enabling you to enjoy the blessing of the throne, suggesting a direct, intimate connection with God's power and presence, and gaining the capacity to embrace the whole universe.
Embrace the whole universe, like having a much bigger perspective, understanding God's larger plan.
That seems to be the implication. A profound spiritual capacity and viewpoint.
Is there an example given for this?
They use the Apostle Paul. In Acts 19, Paul expresses his own desire, I must see Rome. Later, in Acts 27, after a shipwreck and immense danger, God tells him directly, do not fear, Paul. You must stand before Caesar.
So his personal desire aligned with God's ultimate plan for him to reach Rome, the center of power.
Right, and the speaker interprets this connection, suggesting that when Paul's spiritual state aligned when God addressed his fear, do not fear, it positioned him within God's sovereign plan in a way that could even change the throne, influence the highest levels of worldly power.
So changing your internal state, dealing with fear through the imprinted gospel, can unlock your role in God's bigger purposes.
That's the connection they make. And they loop back one more time to the brain's role, using that vegetable pastor story again.
The one who woke up after hearing messages.
Yes, to reinforce, when the brain is made alive, activated by the word, the spirit becomes alive. It hammers home the brain's crucial role as the physical vessel and control tower for this entire spiritual process, as they frame it.
So wrapping it all up, spirit, soul, body are all important pieces.
But the central battleground, the main event, is internal. It's the fight against those deep-seated, Satan-influenced imprints within us.
And the key, the absolute key, according to this lecture, is changing those imprints by actively, diligently editing the gospel into our minds and spirits. Using these practical methods, that's what opens the door to seeing God really work.
That's the essence of it.
Wow. Okay,
And
that was definitely a deep dive. We've walked through this lecture's framework. The crucial idea of the spiritual state, the breakdown of spirit, soul, and body, this pervasive problem of negative imprints and belief systems.
And their proposed solution, actively editing the gospel through things like transcribing, meditating, memorizing, really concrete actions.
And the consistent message from the source is that this isn't just theory. It's presented as the reality of our life, impacting how you see everything, yourself, others, problems, the world.
It really is a call to recognize this unseen internal landscape and to take responsibility for actively shaping it with intention.
So here's something for you to think about this week listening to this. If this framework holds true, that our identity and reactions are so tied to these deep imprints and that they're always being influenced, what's one small step you could take to be more intentional about the messages you're allowing to be imprinted on your own mind and spirit?
And maybe consider this too. The lecture suggests that understanding these spiritual facts allows you to see past the surface, past your own biases, to see people and situations more as God might see them. How could seeking that kind of discernment, that different way of seeing, change how you interact with your world day to day?
Just some food for thought to take away from this deep dive.